Harlem in the late 1960s was a battlefield. The Mafia had long controlled the flow of heroin in New York, setting prices, cutting product, and enforcing their will through fear. But then Frank Lucas arrived. To the casual observer, he was just another man on the street. To the people who understood power, he was a strategist who would quietly dismantle decades of Mafia dominance. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina. One of 10 children, he grew up understanding scarcity, discipline, and the subtle rules of human behavior. From a young age, he watched how fear, loyalty, and opportunity shaped lives, and he learned to see patterns that others missed. In his teens, Lucas moved north in search of work. Harlem became his home, a neighborhood full of ambition, risk, and danger. Early on, he realized that violence alone could not guarantee power. The Mafia ruled with muscle, but he saw the opportunity to outsmart them, to operate not as a pawn but as a strategist. Lucas began working under Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's legendary crime figure. From him, Lucas learned the value of discretion, loyalty, and intelligence over brute force. Violence, Bumpy taught, was a tool, not a strategy. Lucas absorbed this lesson deeply, realizing that true power comes from influence, timing, and understanding human behavior. By the late 1960s, Lucas had identified the weak points in the Mafia's heroin business. The traditional system relied on intermediaries, inflated costs, and diluted product. Users and small-time dealers had little choice, but inefficiencies left room for innovation. Lucas envisioned a system that bypassed the Mafia completely, importing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, cutting middlemen, controlling quality, and branding the product. This became Blue Magic, Lucas's heroin brand. Its purity and consistency created loyalty among dealers and users alike. The streets began to notice. Here was a product better than the Mafia, at lower cost, delivered more reliably. Lucas did not rely on violence to compete. He used efficiency and reliability to make the Mafia's methods obsolete. He ran Harlem like a corporation. Shipments were tracked, personnel were trained and disciplined, and financial operations were meticulously managed. Associates were rewarded for loyalty, punished for betrayal, and instructed to maintain discretion. Lucas understood that to dismantle the Mafia's power, he had to operate smarter, not bloodier. By 1970, Lucas's network extended beyond Harlem to Philadelphia and other cities. Mafia families were blindsided. Their long-established pipelines were suddenly undercut by a competitor who offered better products at lower prices without bloody turf wars. Lucas had effectively made them powerless in Harlem, not through violence, but through strategy, timing, and innovation. Law enforcement noticed the shift. Lucas's operations were unusually efficient, the streets unusually calm, and the Mafia unusually quiet. He had created a new model, control through intelligence and organization, not intimidation. To the world outside Harlem, Frank Lucas was invisible. To those inside, he was the new king, a man who had stripped the Mafia of its influence without a single dramatic confrontation. Harlem had changed. Dealers and users shifted to Blue Magic, the Mafia's old methods became obsolete, and a new order emerged, one built on planning, trust, and precision rather than fear. Frank Lucas had achieved something remarkable. He had made the Mafia powerless in the streets he controlled, all while remaining in plain sight. Frank Lucas understood something that the Mafia never fully grasped. Control over supply meant control over the market. The traditional Mafia model relied on multiple middlemen, importers, distributors, and street-level dealers, each cutting the product, inflating prices, and adding inefficiency. Frank saw an opportunity to bypass the entire chain, cutting costs, improving quality, and undermining their authority. He established direct connections to suppliers in Southeast Asia, sourcing heroin straight from the Golden Triangle. This move was audacious. It defied the established mafia channels and risked drawing attention from both competitors and law enforcement. But Lucas was careful. He built relationships with reliability and loyalty, selecting contacts who respected discipline and discretion. By cutting out the mafia intermediaries, Frank could offer a product that was not only purer but also cheaper. Blue Magic became a trusted brand on the streets. Dealers preferred it because it sold faster. Users preferred it because it was consistent. Loyalty shifted naturally. The mafia, which had relied on monopolistic control, suddenly found itself irrelevant in Harlem. Lucas's brilliance was not only in sourcing but also in logistics. He coordinated shipments with military-like precision, ensuring minimal risk of theft or interception. Packages were moved discreetly, and distribution points were tightly controlled. Associates were trained to follow exact procedures, reducing mistakes and exposure. The operation ran efficiently, almost like a legitimate business, which contrasted sharply with the mafia's reliance on violence to enforce order. To solidify his dominance, Lucas also understood the power of psychology and branding. Blue Magic was more than heroin. It was a symbol of reliability. Dealers knew they could trust the product. Users knew they could rely on it. In a world where inconsistency and deception were common, this predictability gave Lucas a decisive advantage. Meanwhile, the mafia struggled to adapt. Their old suppliers, accustomed to controlling every step, were bypassed. Middlemen were cut off from profits, and their authority in Harlem eroded. Violence and intimidation, the mafia's traditional tools, were ineffective against Frank's efficiency and discipline. Without supply or influence, they became powerless in the very streets they had once controlled. Lucas also enforced loyalty among his team with subtlety rather than brutality. Associates who followed the rules were rewarded. Those who betrayed him faced consequences quietly and decisively. This created a culture of discipline and trust, further stabilizing his operation. Unlike the mafia, which relied heavily on fear, Frank built control through reliability and human management, making him a strategist rather than a thug. By the early 1970s, Lucas had established a network that extended beyond Harlem, influencing multiple cities while keeping the mafia on the defensive. Dealers abandoned old alliances because Blue Magic was profitable, predictable, and safe. Frank Lucas had not just entered the heroin market, he had rewritten the rules, rendering the mafia powerless without firing a shot. The streets had a new order. Efficiency replaced fear, quality replaced chaos, and strategy replaced brute force. Frank Lucas had created a system that the mafia could neither infiltrate nor dominate, and the foundation of his empire was now secure. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas's operation was no longer just a Harlem phenomenon. His network stretched into Philadelphia, parts of New Jersey, and beyond. The efficiency of his system, direct supply, strict logistics, and disciplined distribution, had created a market that the mafia could no longer influence. They were no longer the gatekeepers. Frank controlled both supply and loyalty. Expansion required more than heroin shipments. Lucas built a disciplined network of trusted associates who understood rules, hierarchy, and operational security. Every shipment, every distribution point, and every dealer had a place in the system. Mistakes were costly, but discipline and oversight reduced errors, strengthened loyalty, and kept law enforcement at bay. Unlike the mafia, which often relied on intimidation and violent displays to enforce control, Lucas used strategy and foresight. Violence was a tool of last resort. Most control came from organization, predictability, and the incentive of profit. Associates who followed the rules were rewarded handsomely. Those who betrayed him were removed quietly, without drawing attention. Loyalty was maintained through intelligence, not fear alone. Lucas also mastered the art of public invisibility. In Harlem, he maintained the image of a community man, a father, a churchgoer, a neighbor. To law enforcement and the public, he appeared unremarkable, which shielded him from scrutiny even as his empire grew. His dual existence, ordinary on the surface, strategic and controlling beneath, was central to his success. Meanwhile, the Mafia was forced to react. Their old enforcement strategies, intimidation, territorial fights, and control of suppliers were ineffective against a system based on reliability and efficiency. Dealers abandoned Mafia networks in favor of blue magic. Users preferred it. Lucas had created demand that no Mafia family could counter. Their influence in Harlem, once nearly absolute, had eroded. Frank's foresight extended to law enforcement too. He compartmentalized operations, limited the knowledge of associates, and anticipated vulnerabilities. Every shipment and every transaction was calculated to reduce exposure. Even as federal agencies began investigating the heroin market, Lucas's careful planning delayed detection. By combining operational discipline, strategic expansion, and public invisibility, Lucas had built an empire that was profitable, organized, and resilient. The Mafia, accustomed to dominance through fear and monopoly over supply, had no answer. Their influence was reduced to whispers, while Lucas controlled the streets openly but subtly. Frank Lucas's approach was revolutionary in the heroin trade. He had shown that intelligence, loyalty, and organization could achieve what brute force never could: total control over a market, while keeping both rivals and law enforcement uncertain of the next move. Harlem had a new king, and the Mafia, once unchallenged, was powerless in the streets he controlled. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas's empire had reached heights few could imagine. Blue magic flowed through Harlem and beyond with unprecedented efficiency, and the Mafia, once dominant, had been sidelined completely. Yet, with great power came new challenges. Operating outside the law meant constant risk, from law enforcement, rivals, and even trusted associates. The first cracks appeared internally. As Lucas's organization expanded, more associates joined, increasing the risk of mistakes, disloyalty, or betrayal. Some were tempted by greed, others coerced by authorities. Even the most disciplined networks are vulnerable to human unpredictability, and Lucas knew that his success depended on managing it carefully. To counter these risks, Lucas maintained strict discipline. Rules were clear: loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished. Associates were monitored, shipments compartmentalized, and sensitive information limited to key trusted lieutenants. By creating a culture of accountability, he reduced exposure and maintained operational stability despite increasing internal complexity. Meanwhile, law enforcement began closing in. The DEA, FBI, and local police recognized the scale and sophistication of Lucas's network. They deployed surveillance, informants, and wiretaps, seeking to map the flow of heroin and identify its source. Unlike typical street-level operations, Lucas's empire was structured like a corporation, making it harder to dismantle, but the authorities' persistence was growing. Lucas anticipated these pressures. He compartmentalized operations, rerouted shipments, and rotated personnel to limit vulnerability. He understood that exposure could come from any angle: careless associates, investigative breakthroughs, or even rival gangs attempting to reclaim influence. His approach was strategic: anticipate, adapt, and maintain control without drawing attention. Despite these measures, the operation's very size created risk. The more shipments moved, the more potential points of failure existed. The Mafia, although sidelined, still loomed as a latent threat. Rival organizations could exploit any sign of weakness. Lucas's empire, built on efficiency and intelligence, now faced the inevitable reality of law enforcement pressure and human unpredictability. By 1976, federal authorities had gathered enough information to act decisively. Some of Lucas's associates, facing arrest, agreed to cooperate, providing critical intelligence on shipments, personnel, and operations. The very loyalty he had cultivated was tested under pressure, illustrating that even the most disciplined network can be vulnerable to human frailty. The streets, once stable under Lucas's invisible control, began to feel the tremors of change. Law enforcement attention increased, internal strain grew, and rivals observed openings. For the first time, the empire that had made the Mafia powerless faced forces beyond strategic manipulation, forces that could dismantle even the most well-organized system. Frank Lucas's story was a paradox. He had outsmarted one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history, yet the very structure that gave him strength also made him vulnerable. The coming arrests and investigations would mark the beginning of the end for the empire he had built in plain sight. By the late 1970s, the empire Frank Lucas had built was under siege. Federal authorities, armed with testimony from former associates and detailed surveillance, were ready to dismantle the network he had carefully constructed. The very efficiency that had made him untouchable now made him a high-value target for law enforcement. The arrests began quietly but decisively. Key lieutenants were detained and offered plea deals in exchange for information. This intelligence allowed authorities to map the operation, shipment routes, financial flows, and personnel structures. Even the most loyal associates, facing long prison sentences, were vulnerable to pressure. When the authorities moved against Lucas, he did not resist violently. He understood the stakes and the futility of confrontation. To the public, he remained calm and composed, maintaining his image as a community figure. Privately, he calculated the consequences and sought to protect whatever remained of his operation. The trial became a national spectacle. Prosecutors emphasized the scale of the operation: direct importation of heroin from Southeast Asia, distribution across multiple cities, and the branding of blue magic. Lucas's defense attempted to frame him as a manager rather than a violent criminal, highlighting that he had avoided unnecessary bloodshed. But the overwhelming evidence, financial records, shipments, and witness testimony, made conviction inevitable. Lucas was sentenced on multiple counts, including heroin distribution and conspiracy. His empire, which had made the Mafia powerless in Harlem, collapsed almost overnight. Associates were prosecuted or fled. Rivals scrambled to fill the void. The streets, which had experienced a strange order under Lucas, returned to volatility and violence. Despite the collapse, Lucas's influence endured as a case study in intelligence and organization. Law enforcement analyzed his methods, noting that his system had combined discipline, loyalty, and strategic thinking to dominate a market without relying on fear alone. Criminologists and historians later cited his operation as an example of how efficiency, planning, and foresight could outperform traditional violence-based control. In Harlem, the absence of Lucas was felt immediately. Violence returned, rival dealers fought for control, and the community lost the invisible order he had imposed. The Mafia, though weakened before, now watched cautiously, learning lessons from the rise and fall of a man who had outmaneuvered them entirely. Frank Lucas's story highlighted a central truth of criminal enterprise. Brilliance and organization can achieve extraordinary dominance, but no empire outside the law is immune to collapse. Human unpredictability, betrayal, and legal pressure are constants that even the most intelligent operator must confront. After serving a substantial portion of his federal sentence, Frank Lucas returned to Harlem a changed man. The streets he once controlled had shifted, rival gangs filled the void, violence returned, and the temporary order he had imposed vanished. Yet for Lucas, the story of Harlem was never just about drugs. It was about human behavior, strategy, and the limits of power. Lucas remained largely out of the drug trade after his release. He occasionally spoke to journalists and appeared in documentaries, offering reflections on the empire he had built, the Mafia he had sidelined, and the lessons of loyalty, discipline, and foresight. He spoke analytically, emphasizing human psychology and strategy rather than glorifying his criminal past. His legacy endures in two ways: operational and cultural. Operationally, Lucas demonstrated that illegal enterprises could operate like businesses. By sourcing directly from Southeast Asia, controlling quality and branding his product, he reduced inefficiency and minimized conflict. Law enforcement studied his methods to understand organized crime, while future operators noted both the brilliance and vulnerability of his approach. Culturally, Lucas became a symbol of audacity and intelligence. Movies, books, and documentaries portrayed him as a man who had rewritten the rules, outsmarting the Mafia without firing a single dramatic shot. Harlem remembered him not only as a drug kingpin, but as a figure who had imposed structure and discipline on chaotic streets. Lucas's life illustrated the paradox of criminal enterprise. He caused harm on a massive scale, yet he demonstrated extraordinary intelligence, strategic planning, and organizational skill. His approach relied on loyalty and efficiency rather than fear, proving that discipline could achieve dominance where violence often failed. He also reflected openly on the human cost of his choices: associates imprisoned or dead, families affected, and communities disrupted. He acknowledged mistakes and accepted responsibility, emphasizing that even the most intelligent operator outside the law is vulnerable to human frailty and legal consequences. Frank Lucas passed away in 2019, but his story continues to intrigue and instruct. His empire had made the Mafia powerless in Harlem, yet it was ultimately temporary, undone by betrayal, law enforcement, and the inherent risks of operating outside the law. Still, the intelligence, discipline, and foresight that built it remain a blueprint of strategic thinking under extreme circumstances. In the end, Frank Lucas teaches a fundamental lesson. Control, influence, and power can be achieved through strategy and intelligence rather than force alone. But no empire, however brilliant, is immune to human unpredictability and legal consequence. He did not just run the streets. He studied them, shaped them, and left a legacy that continues to resonate in Harlem, in organized crime studies, and in the broader understanding of power itself. Frank Lucas made the Mafia powerless. He did so not with gunfire or intimidation, but with strategy, foresight, and an understanding of human nature, a lesson that endures long after the streets he controlled have changed.